My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for most of my life, I believed there was something wrong with me. Not because my teacher said so, not because my friends ignored me, but because the one man whose opinion mattered most, my father, spent years making me believe I would never be enough. Whenever people asked him about his children, his face would light up when he talked about my older brother, Daniel. Daniel is a brilliant businessman, he'd say proudly. He's going to take over one of the biggest companies in the state. Then someone would ask about me. His smile would fade. Oh, Sarah? He would pause for a second before answering. She joined the army. There was always disappointment in his voice. Not anger, not hatred, just disappointment. As if I had wasted every opportunity life had given me. When I was little, my father wasn't always like that. He taught me how to ride a bicycle. He helped me build my first treehouse. He never missed my elementary school plays. Back then, I truly believed I was Daddy's little girl. Everything changed after my brother entered high school. Daniel became the perfect student. Straight A's. Basketball captain. Student council president. Every trophy he brought home found a place in our living room. Every achievement became another story my father proudly shared with neighbors and relatives. I admired my brother. I never competed with him. But somewhere along the way, Dad started comparing us. Why can't you be more like Daniel? I heard those words so often they became part of my life. When I earned a B on a math test, Daniel would have earned an A. When I volunteered at an animal shelter, Daniel was preparing for business competitions. When I spent weekends helping elderly veterans clean their homes, Dad asked why I wasn't taking extra finance classes. Nothing I did ever seemed valuable enough. My mother noticed. She often found me sitting alone on the back porch after dinner. "You know your father loves you," she'd whisper. I always nodded. But deep inside, I wondered if love was supposed to feel this lonely. Everything became worse after high school graduation. Daniel received acceptance letters from prestigious universities across the country. The day Harvard accepted him, my father cried. Actual tears. I'd never seen that before. The following week, I announced that I wanted to join the United States Army. The room became silent. Dad slowly placed his coffee cup on the table. The Army? Yes. I want to serve. He stared at me for several seconds. No. I thought he hadn't heard me correctly. I've already spoken with a recruiter. I've made my decision. His voice became colder. No daughter of mine is throwing her life away. It's not throwing my life away. It is. You'll spend years taking orders while your brother builds a future. Mom tried to calm him. Honey, but he wasn't listening. For 18 years I've worked to give you opportunities. And this is what you choose. I stood there with tears filling my eyes. I want my life to mean something. He laughed. You think wearing a uniform makes you important? No. I think helping people does. He shook his head. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. Those words stayed with me long after I left the room. 3 months later, I graduated from basic combat training. The ceremony was held on a bright summer morning. Families filled the parade field. Soldiers searched the crowd for familiar faces. I searched too. Every few minutes, I looked toward the entrance. Maybe Dad was running late. Maybe traffic delayed him. Maybe. Hours passed. The ceremony ended. Families hugged their sons and daughters. Photographs were taken. Laughter echoed across the field. I stood alone. Finally, my phone vibrated. It was a text message from my mother. Dad couldn't make it. I'm so proud of you. I love you. I smiled, but I cried all the way back to the barracks. Years passed. Military life wasn't easy. I served during hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. I helped evacuate families from burning neighborhoods. I carried frightened children through rising floodwaters. I spent countless nights sleeping on concrete floors inside emergency shelters. None of it felt glamorous. None of it made me famous. But every person we helped reminded me why I had chosen this path. For the first time in my life, I felt useful. I felt respected. I felt seen. Not because of medals. Not because of rank. Because my teammates trusted me. And that trust meant more than any trophy ever could. 8 years later, I had become a captain. The promotion ceremony was simple. Afterward, my commanding officer shook my hand. "You've earned every bit of this." "Thank you, sir." He smiled. "Never let anyone convince you that service isn't success." Those words stayed with me, especially because I knew someone still believed exactly that. My father. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. "Dad." I hesitated before answering. His voice sounded unusually excited. "Sarah, your brother has something important to celebrate. He's just been promoted to executive vice president. We're hosting a formal dinner this Saturday. The entire city's business community will be there. I expect you to attend." For a brief moment, I thought perhaps this was his way of reconnecting. Then he added quietly, "And please, wear something elegant, not your military uniform." I looked toward the dress uniform hanging inside my closet. That uniform represented 8 years of sacrifice. 8 years of missed holidays. 8 years of serving complete strangers. Why should I hide it? "I'll think about it," I answered. His reply came instantly. "Don't embarrass this family." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. Something told me Saturday night would change everything. Saturday arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of my closet for nearly 20 minutes. On the left hung a navy blue evening dress my mother had bought me years earlier. It was elegant, simple, and exactly the kind of outfit my father wanted me to wear. On the right hung my army dress uniform, perfectly pressed. Every ribbon carefully aligned. Every medal earned through years of long nights, difficult missions, and sacrifices nobody outside the military would ever understand. I reached toward the dress, then stopped. I remembered every soldier I had served beside. I remembered the families we had rescued after hurricanes, the children we carried through floodwaters, the exhausted firefighters who thanked us after wildfire evacuations. That uniform wasn't about me. It represented every person who had stood beside me. I couldn't hide it simply because someone else was embarrassed by it. I carefully put on the uniform. As I looked into the mirror, I smiled. Not because I looked impressive, because for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to become the person my father wanted. I was finally comfortable being the person I already was. The Grand Wellington Hotel stood in the center of downtown, surrounded by expensive restaurants and luxury office buildings. Valets hurried from one vehicle to another while photographers captured pictures of arriving guests. As I stepped from my car, several people turned toward me. Some smiled respectfully after noticing the uniform. Others simply nodded. Military uniforms always seemed to draw quiet respect. I walked confidently through the revolving doors. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across polished marble floors. Fresh, white roses decorated every table. Soft violin music filled the air. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with champagne and appetizers. Everything looked perfect. Almost too perfect. Near the entrance, my father greeted important guests one after another. When he finally noticed me, his smile disappeared. He walked over quickly. "I thought I told you not to wear that." I remained calm. "I remember." "Then why would you ignore me?" "I'm not ignoring you. I'm simply wearing my uniform." He glanced around nervously. Several businessmen had already noticed us. "This isn't an army event." "I know." "Then why couldn't you wear a normal dress?" I took a slow breath. "Because this is who I am."
His jaw tightened. "No."
"This is your job. It isn't your identity." I looked him directly in the eyes. "It became part of my identity the day I promised to serve." He shook his head. "You always have to make everything difficult." Before I could answer, another guest approached. Dad immediately forced another smile. "There she is. My daughter." He didn't even introduce my name. He simply turned back toward the guest and changed the subject. I quietly walked away. A familiar voice called my name. "Captain Mitchell?" I turned. An elderly man wearing a dark suit stood nearby. His posture was unmistakable. Military. He extended his hand. "Colonel James Walker. Retired." I smiled. "It's an honor to meet you, Colonel. I've heard wonderful things about your disaster response work." I blinked. You have? He nodded. My nephew served under your command during the Tennessee floods. He said your leadership saved dozens of families. I smiled modestly. The whole unit worked together. The colonel laughed. That's exactly what he said you'd say. Before we could continue talking, another guest interrupted. Then another. Within minutes, I found myself speaking with several veterans. They asked about rescue missions, training, leadership. Not one of them cared about my medals. They cared about the people behind the stories. For the first time that evening, I felt comfortable. Across the ballroom, my father watched everything. His expression grew more frustrated each time another guest chose to speak with me. Daniel noticed. Dad. It's okay. They're just being polite. Dad forced a smile. I know, but I could tell. He didn't like it. Tonight was supposed to celebrate Daniel. Yet people kept drifting toward the army officer standing quietly near the back of the room. Not because I demanded attention, because curiosity naturally followed service. A few minutes later, my mother found me near one of the large windows overlooking the city. She gently squeezed my hand. You look beautiful. Thanks, Mom. She looked at my uniform and smiled proudly. You know, when you were 10 years old, you used to line up all your stuffed animals and pretend they were disaster victims. I laughed. I remember. You'd spend hours making tiny blankets for them. I thought everyone did that. She laughed softly.
No.
You've always wanted to protect people. She became quiet. I'm sorry your father never understood that. I looked toward him. He understands success. We just define it differently. She sighed. I hope tonight changes something. So do I. At exactly 7 o'clock, a bell rang through the ballroom. Guests slowly found their seats. My father stepped onto the small stage. He adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all. Applause echoed across the room. He smiled proudly. Tonight we celebrate my son Daniel. Another round of applause followed. For nearly 10 minutes, he listed Daniel's accomplishments. University honors, corporate promotions, business awards, international travel. Every sentence made the audience admire him even more. Daniel looked slightly embarrassed. Finally, Dad looked toward me. And my daughter Sarah. He chuckled. She always preferred adventure over ambition. Several guests laughed politely. While Daniel built a successful career, Sarah decided to play soldier. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. I lowered my eyes. The words hurt, not because strangers heard them, because they came from my father. He continued, maybe someday she'll decide to join the real world. This time, almost nobody laughed. Instead, the room became strangely quiet. Even Daniel looked uncomfortable. He slowly lowered his head. My mother stared at the floor. I wanted nothing more than to leave. I quietly reached for my purse beneath the table. Maybe I could slip away before dinner began. Then, the ballroom doors opened. A military aide entered first. He spoke briefly with hotel staff. Seconds later, everyone stood. A tall man wearing 4 silver stars on his shoulders walked inside. General Richard Anderson. No one knew it yet, but the next few minutes would completely change my father's understanding of success. The moment General Richard Anderson entered the ballroom, the atmosphere changed completely. Conversation stopped. The soft music faded into the background. Even the waiters paused, unsure whether to continue serving or step aside. My father quickly climbed down from the stage. His confident smile returned as he hurried toward the entrance. General Anderson, he said enthusiastically. What an incredible honor. Thank you for joining us. The general accepted the handshake politely, but his attention was elsewhere. His eyes slowly scanned the ballroom. Business executives, local politicians, retired judges, successful entrepreneurs. Then, his gaze stopped on me. For a second, neither of us moved. Recognition flashed across his face. A warm smile appeared. Instead of following my father toward the head table, the general walked directly across the ballroom, straight toward me. Whispers spread immediately. Does he know her? Who is she? Why is he walking over there? I stood the moment he reached my table. Good evening, sir. The general smiled. Captain Sarah Mitchell. It's wonderful to see you again. I saluted. He immediately returned the salute. The entire ballroom fell silent. No one expected a four-star general to salute a captain in the middle of a private family dinner. My father looked completely confused. I'm sorry, General, he interrupted awkwardly. I believe you've mistaken my daughter for someone else. General Anderson slowly turned toward him.
No.
I know exactly who Captain Mitchell is. His calm voice carried across the room. I've known about her service for several years. My father's smile faded. You have? The general nodded. I've read every after-action report involving her humanitarian task force. He looked back at me. Your leadership has been noticed far beyond your unit. I felt my face grow warm. Thank you, sir. It was always a team effort. The general laughed quietly. I expected that answer. You've never taken credit for yourself. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged curious glances. My father tried to regain control of the situation. General, perhaps you'd like to meet my son Daniel. He's the reason we're celebrating tonight. The general smiled politely. I certainly will. But first, he looked directly at me. I've wanted to thank Captain Mitchell personally. I blinked. Sir? He nodded. Sometimes paperwork doesn't tell the whole story. I prefer meeting remarkable officers face to face. The room became even quieter. Several guests stared at me in disbelief. For years, I had been invisible at family gatherings. Now the highest-ranking officer in the room seemed more interested in speaking with me than anyone else. It didn't feel real. General Anderson folded his hands behind his back. Captain, do you remember the Kentucky flood response 3 years ago? I smiled. I do, sir. I'll never forget it. Neither would I. Days of relentless rain had caused rivers to overflow. Entire neighborhoods disappeared underwater. Thousands of families were evacuated. It was one of the longest rescue operations of my career. The general looked toward the guests. Most people only saw the news headlines. I saw the reports. He paused. What they didn't show on television was Captain Mitchell carrying an elderly woman nearly half a mile through freezing floodwater after rescue vehicles became trapped. Several guests gasped. I immediately shook my head. Sir, there were dozens of soldiers helping. Yes, there were. But only one officer refused to leave until every civilian was safely evacuated. The ballroom remained silent. My father stared at me. His expression had changed. For the first time that evening, he wasn't embarrassed. He looked uncertain, as if he were hearing about a stranger instead of his own daughter. The general continued. Captain Mitchell never requested recognition. She never mentioned the operation afterward. In fact, he smiled. I only learned the full story because another soldier nominated her for commendation. I quietly looked down. I didn't think anyone remembered. Oh, they remembered. The general's voice was steady. The people you helped never forgot. The ballroom remained completely still. My father slowly sat down in the nearest chair. Daniel looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not jealousy. Respect. Real respect. General Anderson glanced around the room one more time before saying, Ladies and gentlemen, I believe tonight's celebration is about to become much more meaningful. General Anderson stepped away from the center of the ballroom and picked up a glass of water from a nearby table. He didn't rush. He didn't seem interested in making a dramatic speech. Instead, he looked around the room with the calm confidence that only decades of leadership could bring. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steady. Most people believe leadership begins with rank. He paused. In my experience, it begins with character. The ballroom remained completely silent. I've commanded thousands of soldiers during my career. I've met officers with extraordinary intelligence. I've met officers with remarkable physical strength. But very few possess something far more valuable. He turned toward me. Compassion. I immediately lowered my eyes. Praise had always made me uncomfortable. General Anderson noticed. He smiled. See, she still doesn't enjoy attention. Several guests laughed softly. The tension in the room eased just a little. Then the general continued. 3 years ago, after the Kentucky flood operation, I asked several commanders one simple question. If your own family were trapped during a disaster, which officer would you trust to lead the rescue? He looked around the ballroom. The same name appeared again, and again, and again. He turned toward me. Captain Sarah Mitchell. The room filled with quiet whispers. My father slowly looked at me. I could see confusion written across his face. For years he had believed I was simply another army officer. He had no idea what my reputation actually was. The general continued. Not because she was the highest-ranking officer. Not because she was the strongest. But because every soldier who served beside her knew one thing. He paused. She never left anyone behind. A retired Marine sitting near the front slowly nodded. I've served with leaders like that, he said quietly. They're rare. General Anderson smiled. They are. He looked back toward the guests. Leadership isn't measured by how many people work for you. It's measured by how many people trust you when everything falls apart. My father remained speechless. For perhaps the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about promotions, or salaries, or impressive job titles. He was hearing an entirely different definition of success. The general suddenly looked at me. Captain. Yes, sir. Do you remember Private Ethan Brooks? My heart immediately skipped. Of course. How could I ever forget? Ethan had been only 19 years old during his first disaster deployment. He was enthusiastic, hardworking, always smiling, until one night during a rescue operation, everything changed. General Anderson addressed the room. A bridge collapsed during severe flooding. Several rescue vehicles became trapped. Private Brooks panicked. He froze. He believed everyone around him was about to die. The ballroom remained silent. Captain Mitchell reached him first. I remembered every second. Ethan couldn't breathe. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. The water kept rising. Everyone else focused on evacuating civilians. I stayed beside him. I reminded him to breathe. Step by step. Minute by minute. Eventually, he stood. Then, he helped rescue 12 more civilians that night. The general smiled. Last month, Private Brooks graduated from Officer Candidate School. Several guests smiled. He personally requested that one sentence be included in his graduation speech. The general looked directly at me. He said, "The officer who saved my career wasn't the one who gave me orders, she was the one who reminded me not to give up on myself." A wave of emotion passed through the room. I swallowed hard. I hadn't even known Ethan remembered that conversation. General Anderson nodded. You changed his life. I shook my head. He changed his own life. I simply reminded him who he already was. The general laughed softly. There you go again. Always giving someone else the credit. Across the ballroom, Daniel slowly stood from his chair.
He walked toward me.
For years, my brother and I had rarely spoken about our careers. Not because we disliked each other, because our father had always compared us.
Daniel stopped beside me.
I owe you an apology.
I looked surprised.
For what? I never realized how unfair Dad had been. I smiled gently. You didn't do anything. He shook his head. I stayed quiet. I should have spoken up. I placed a hand on his shoulder. We were both trying to make him proud. Daniel looked down. I think. He smiled sadly. You were the one who succeeded. Before I could answer, my father slowly stood from his chair. Every guest watched him. His hands trembled slightly. He looked toward the general, then toward me. For the first time that evening, he seemed unable to find the right words. And deep inside, I realized this conversation was about to change both of our lives for Eve. The ballroom was so quiet that I could hear the faint sound of glasses being placed on tables. My father stood frozen. For nearly 30 seconds, he didn't speak. This was the same man who could command a boardroom full of executives without hesitation. The same man who always had the perfect answer. Tonight, he seemed completely lost. Finally, he looked at General Anderson. General. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. May I ask you something? Of course. How long have you known my daughter? The general smiled. long enough to know that she's one of the finest officers I've had the privilege of meeting.
My father swallowed hard.
I never knew. The general answered gently. That's because she never talks about herself. I looked away. He was right. Every mission I had completed stayed at work. I never brought those stories home. Not because they weren't important, because many of them belonged to the people we had helped. Their pain wasn't mine to display. The general continued. Do you know what impressed me most about Captain Mitchell? My father quietly shook his head. It wasn't her leadership. It wasn't her courage. It wasn't even her service record. The room waited. It was what she did when nobody was watching. He turned toward the guests. After every major disaster operation, soldiers are exhausted. They've gone days without proper sleep. They've carried children, comforted grieving families, and worked until their bodies could barely stand. Most people return to their rooms and collapse.
He looked at me.
Captain Mitchell didn't. Instead, she walked through every temporary shelter before going to bed. She asked every family the same question. Is there anyone we forgot? Several guests exchanged emotional glances. The general smiled. That question alone led to dozens of additional rescues. It wasn't part of her orders. No one asked her to do it. She simply cared. My father slowly sat down again. He covered his face with one hand. For years, he had judged my life using titles, promotions, and income. Now he was hearing stories that couldn't be measured by any of those things. A woman sitting near the front of the ballroom suddenly stood. She looked to be in her late 60s. She walked toward me slowly. When she stopped, she smiled through tears. You probably don't remember me. I studied her face. Something felt familiar. Then I remembered. The Cedar Valley shelter? She nodded. My husband was trapped after the tornado. You stayed with me the entire night. Memory rushed back. She had been terrified. She hadn't eaten for almost 2 days. I had simply sat beside her until rescue crews located her husband. She reached into her purse and removed a folded photograph. I carry this everywhere. It showed an elderly couple standing outside a rebuilt home. My husband survived. He passed away peacefully last year. She looked into my eyes. But because of you, we had 6 more wonderful years together. Tears filled the room. She gently hugged me. Thank you. I could barely speak. You don't have to thank me. Oh, she smiled. I'll spend the rest of my life thanking you. As she returned to her seat, I noticed my father watching with tears in his eyes. He had never seen this side of my life. Not because it didn't exist. Because he had never asked. General Anderson looked around the ballroom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I've attended ceremonies in the White House. I've stood beside presidents. I've presented medals to extraordinary soldiers. But tonight, I witnessed something equally important. He turned toward my father, a parent discovering who their child truly is. No one moved. The general's voice softened. Sometimes, we become so focused on someone's career that we forget to notice their character. My father's shoulders slowly dropped. For the first time in years, he looked less like a successful businessman and more like a father realizing how much he had missed. He slowly walked toward me. Every step seemed heavy. He stopped only inches away. His eyes were red. I'm sorry. The words were barely louder than a whisper. I should have known you. I should have asked. I should have listened. I didn't answer immediately. There were too many memories, too many years, too many moments when I had hoped to hear exactly those words. Finally, I smiled. We still have time, Dad. A tear rolled down his cheek. I hope so. He carefully placed his hand on my shoulder. For the first time in my life, I understand what success really looks like. Around us, several guests quietly applauded. Not because anyone had won an argument, but because something far more meaningful had happened. A broken relationship had taken its first step toward healing. General Anderson glanced at his watch, then smiled at me. Captain, I hope you'll save me a seat at dinner. I laughed softly. Yes, sir. He nodded. I have a feeling tonight is going to be a very memorable evening. He was right. because dinner hadn't even begun yet. And, before the night was over, the truth about one secret mission would leave every person in that ballroom speechless.